Well, hi. Thank you for checking in here on the BDR Lunch Gathering videos. We're glad you're here. We want to let you know that we have quite a few of these videos. In fact, if you go to the BDR site and check out our page, you'll find that here under News and Lunch Gathering, you'll find not only the fact that these educational web seminars are free, there is no cost whatsoever, but you'll find out what's coming up and a complete listing of all the different ones we've had in the recent past and over the past 2 years and a half. All these are good sources of information that I think you'll enjoy. So we invite you to check in, visit with us, and let us know how you appreciate them. There is a little button in the bottom here. It says subscribe. If you click on that to the little bell, you'll get a weekly reminder when new posts are made. And we, again, thank you for being part of our family. So here we are. It's another Thursday. Very interesting one, I think. And today our guests are James Scott and Gary Cavell. I say Cavell Mertz. That's sort of the shorthand, isn't it, guys? You're a little bit more. You've now got that aerospace name to it too, don't you?
That's right, and fancy lights on our fenders, and we merged with Capital Airspace Group, I guess, October in 1923. So joined them. We had been colleague firms for, I guess, 20 years, helping each other with stuff. So that just had a bright idea over one too many beers one evening, and it said, let's just
1923.
Something like that.
Well, there's a load of experience that we're going to enjoy today as Gary and James talk to us. And their topic, as you can see, working with the FAA. And I'll just turn it right over to you guys. Anybody have a question? Feel free to jump in, alternate A or pressure space bar.
Thank you, Barry. James?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Appreciate that. And thank you, everybody, for carving out some time to connect today. Like Barry said, by way of introduction, my name is James Scott. I'm one of the senior project managers here at Capital Airspace Group, also the director of FAA programs. So I work with our advocacy team on our side here, our client-facing team, essentially, ensuring that, of course, we're providing the most accurate service to our clients, but then also making sure that we're, of course, adhering to anything and all things FAA related, to include, of course, regulations, orders, et cetera, that guide what we do. So I've been with the company for just over 6.5 years now, largely on our client-facing side, working with developers, getting their projects across the finish line. And then with me, of course, is Gary Cavell, who I think some of you know, but nevertheless, I'm going to open it up or let Gary introduce himself a little bit more for those who may not know him.
I'm afraid I have a bad reputation, and it chases me, so we're fine. I've been around the industry way too long, and there's only a couple of faces on here who've probably been around longer than I have, but we won't call them out. So
perfect. So with that said, and for today's discussion, you can see the items of interest that we're going to cover. When, of course, you need a coordinator file with the FAA, what's the FAA and FCC's processes, what are other federal entities that we may need to consider or involved, and then, of course, other things like what are the FAA timelines if you have to submit to them, as well as what are some important factors or considerations as we're working through that process. And then for possibly some of you, the importance of understanding certain marking and lighting considerations. So with that, we'll jump into governing regulations, publications, and orders to start off. We'll hit both FAA and FCC. First off, on our side, the FAA, that is the Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 77. This is the safe and efficient use and preservation of the navigable airspace system. The intent of Part 77 is it outlines, of course, the requirements for when you must coordinate with the FAA, whether it's a proposed proposed permanent and or temporary structure. And then, of course, within that also outlines the standards to determine if you're an obstruction, and then also the beginning parts of the FAA's aeronautical study process. Essentially, if you need to file, what does that process entail? And that's all under Part 77. FAA Order 7400.2 Papa, soon to be .2 Romeo, essentially branches off of Part 77 and takes a much deeper dive into the FAA's processes in determining if a project is an obstruction or if it's a hazard to air navigation, and ultimately the criteria that the FAA uses in order to make those decisions. And then finally, and on the back end, assuming a project receives determinations of no hazard, there's the FAA's Advisory Circular 70-7460-1 MIC. And those essentially are the standards for marking and lighting, ensuring that various structures across the United States are adhering to the standards put forth in this advisory circular.
And I encourage you to go to the FAA's website and get the 7461M. It shows you, it's written in, by a government lawyer and engineering team. And so it's, some of the language is a little bit stilted, but it's remarkably clear. And there are helpful, we'll show it to you later on in the presentation, but we have, they show you what the marking and lighting looks like, what your tower heights are that would trigger marking and lighting, what kind of banding to do, or what, just the various requirements there. It's a good thing to look through and take a look at what you have now versus what was written on your license decades ago, see what you have. And you do have, we'll cover later, but you do have the ability to change the marking and lighting on your tower, but you have to ask Mother May I first. Just don't go changing things because the tower crew said it's a good idea. The FCC points to the FAA in Part 17. And Part 17 is mercifully short. You can read through that, and it pretty well covers antenna structure registration in the first part, the marking and lighting criteria, which pretty well mimics or duplicates the FAA stuff. And then lighting inspections, when should you do them, and notices of improper operation. And today we had somebody in a local environment say, gee, my tower lights went out. How soon should I file a NOTAM? Well, 30 minutes, I think, is a legal criteria. But he said, well, what if I want to go to my transmitter site first and make sure they're out? Well, it doesn't hurt to file the NOTAM right away. You can always cancel it. But if you're out there flying helicopters in particular, if you're in an area with a lot of medevac, you want to make sure that they know those lights may be out. It's, again, think safety of somebody in an airplane or a helicopter. So don't be hesitant to file a notice, the NOTAM. Okay. We're hearing something odd coming. Anyway, James, you're
Yeah, so this next section is determining if a project needs to be submitted to the FAA for their review. And so under Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 77.9, there is a section, or in that section, it describes when you must submit your project to the FAA. And first is number one, as you see, is if you're on airport. So if you're an on-airport structure, permanent and or temporary, like a crane, doesn't matter how tall or short you are, you must submit that project to the FAA if you're on airport property.
And this can happen to a broadcaster. We have had, I'm aware of somebody up in Alaska that had to build a short pole. The only place he could put it was on airport property. So we needed a blessing of the FAA to let this guy use this pole and one bay antenna on the airport. So it can happen to you.
And if you're not on airport, then there starts to be sloping surfaces that emanate up and away from all public use airports, most conservatively at a ratio of 100 to 1. So for every 100 feet laterally, that surface goes up 1 foot vertically. And even if you're off airport property, but you're a 20-foot pole or a 30-foot pole, depending on how close you are to the airport, you may exceed that sloping surface, which then triggers the need to have to file with the FAA. Another parameter, number 3 here, is if you're in excess of 200 feet above ground level, anywhere in the entire United States. Again, doesn't matter if you're in the middle of nowhere or if you're right next to an airport. If you're greater than 200 feet, you must file with the FAA.
And the key is above ground. If you're on a mountaintop, it's 200 feet above that ground level.
Yep, correct. You'd still have to file with the FAA in that instance as well. And then number 4 is if the FAA ever asks you to file. And this is a bit of an open-ended statement here, but it could be as simple as if you were constructing a project and somebody from the FAA came to your site and asked or questioned, did you submit your project to the FAA, yes or no? in that instance, if they ask you to file, then you're federally obligated to file at that point, and you should do so. Beyond that, another example of this instance for number 4 is if you utilize on the FAA website, there's a notice criteria tool. And that tool, if you punch in the coordinates, site elevation, and maximum structure height, as a result of utilizing that tool, the output will tell you if you need to file yes or no. In years past, we somewhat criticized that tool because there appeared to be more parameters beyond what was codified in Part 77.9. But as time goes on, the FAA has actually provided more credibility and clarity on what's in their tool, to the point where we, to be honest, we very much, I would say at this point, believe in it and say that it's probably the better option to use is the tool itself versus trying to backhand and calculate any numbers as far as if you do or do not need to file. Nevertheless, the FAA tool itself, that notice criteria tool, is another means to which, if you run it and it says you need to file, from our standpoint as a company, that is the FAA asking you to file, in which case you're then federally obligated to. And then the last thing, and I know we get into it a little bit later too, but I'll let Gary touch on some of it right now, is the FCC TAO Air tool as well.
Yeah, TAO Air doesn't report to the FAA, but it's the FCC's way of saying, gee, should you coordinate with the FAA? If it says yes, then you must. If it says no, then you're not obligated to, as far as the FCC is concerned. And you can go on from there as far as the FCC side of the house is. And we'll cover it a little bit more later.
And then number 5 is if anything changes from the existing FAA determination or what was previously approved for you, meaning that if you have a structure where you're now increasing the height or you're moving the location, even subtle changes as little as a foot vertically or a foot laterally could trigger the need to have to go back and file with the FAA. And you potentially couple that with other changes, such as adding or changing a frequency and or power, that could also obligate you to have to submit to the FAA as well.
Notice that the criteria is 1 foot for the location. If you go back into 73-1690 of the FCC rules, B2, and that's a lengthy section, and you go cross-eyed reading it, you've got 3 seconds of fudge factor there before you have to file a 301, and less than 3 seconds, you can do it on a 302. But that's not FAA land. FAA land, you move it by a foot, you got to deal with it. So if you're replacing a tower with another tower and you're not at the same exact spot, technically it requires an FAA study.
And then number 6 is if you propose a structure or tower construction or alteration, that's also subject to FCC licensing, which I'll let Gary take on.
Okay, we go to the next slide and go from there. The FAA 77.7, it's a section called form and time of notice. And quoting from here, the underline, if you're subject to FCC licensing, you must submit notice to the FAA on or before the date the application is filed with the FCC. That is what the FAA is telling you. The concern for them is they don't want airplanes running into your structure. They don't want your structure to cause problems for navigation aids from a reflection point of view, like VORs and ILSs. You can actually have scalloping and deviations of the output of those antenna systems. Or if you're going to interfere with navigation and comm systems, they want to know about it and have a discussion with you about it. And I've listed here on the screen some of the different FAA points, the OEAA, FAA.gov. If you just type in OEAA, FAA, you'll get Google fish for it, and you'll see the obstruction evaluation process outlined there in the notice tool. And there's also buried down there who needs to file section. There's a lot of information in there. Is the thing that's important though is something called the FAA colo or co-location policy. As we go to the next slide, what happened 1,000 years ago, and I think Barry brought this up in the 80s when we were first looking at problems with FM radio in particular, upsetting approaches to airports. The wireless cable industry, not the wireless people, the cell phone and mobile phone industry, when they were building out systems, they were changing, and still to this day, change antennas and transmitters and frequencies quite a bit and it became a huge pain for them to coordinate each and every time what they were doing. So they had a best practices agreement that they, as an industry, got together with the FAA and said, look, we're going to be operating in frequencies above the television band. It's not in an area that you guys normally care about. Can't you carve out an exception? So was born the colo avoid clause. So down to, you can say 698 up to 90 gigahertz, again, above TV. So those particular people really don't have to worry about filing notice that they're using frequencies on a tower with the FAA. Other folks like broadcasters really need to disclose that, hey, we're putting our antenna on this tower. They want to know about it. And there's a reference down there where you can find, or you can just Google fish for colo avoid clause, and you'll see the genesis of this, and it goes through revisions from time to time, but that's where that term comes from. I'll pause here for a minute. Barry, any questions from anybody?
I'll just possibly run this one in. What about if you check and you find that the coordinates that you are listed are not quite correct?
James?
That would, by the book for the FAA, that would mean you'd have to resubmit that structure to the FAA.
The reason I ask is one of the fellows out in Southern California ran a program, and there are a tremendous number of, especially LPFMs, he tells me, that are not where they are licensed to be.
Yeah, in our experience, we've seen that a lot. We do a lot of microwave beam path analyses, and we're oftentimes having to go in and actually readjust or correct the locations from the FCC database, because they're, you know, the towers themselves are 50, 100, 200 plus feet away sometimes from what is in the database itself. So technically, I mean, by the book, the FAA would tell you that that should be refiled or that should be corrected in their system. The catch-22 of it, of course, is that airspace is incredibly binary. So what may have been allowable for what was the perceived original location and versus where the actual structure was built, there could be critical airspace over it that may or may not create a conflict. So it unfortunately can be a gamble sometimes. But the alternative to that is, of course, that God forbid there's ever an accident. Then as a part of the NTSB's review, it could always come out that, okay, well, the charts, publications, et cetera, showed that the tower was here, but it was actually 100 or 200 feet laterally, or supposed to be that way. And so maybe it's not the causal factor of an accident, but is it something that carries the level of liability? Possibly. So we're not attorneys, unfortunately, but I mean, it's,
Unfortunately.
yeah, true. So
Yeah, Frank brought up a good point. There's a lot of these things going back 100 years or so are wrong. And some of it was people didn't know what they were doing. Some of it was they were using maps that were not quite so granular, like 1 to 1,000,000, 1 to 500,000 scale maps to place the coordinates. And then when you go down to 1 to 24,000 scale map, then you can get more accurate, or somebody just couldn't scale coordinates properly. So these sins go back for a long time. And you also have people using GPS data wrong or getting in the wrong datum. So a lot of ways that errors can crop in. And you're faced with, gee, is this a problem? And do I open up this can of worms? And that's where you maybe get your handy lawyer and say, okay, where do I go with this? But James is right. And we've, as Cavell and Merck, before we joined with them, we've had 2 or 3 cases where somebody ran into a tower, and they deposed everybody and their brother, and were looking for things that might have been contributory. And if your tower is spotted in the FAA documents a long way from where it's charted, that could be a problem and a lot of liability there. And I think Grady, did you have a question? Thought I saw you waving.
Yes, thank you. I notice here the business about if you change or add a frequency. What about an AM tower site where it was originally a single station, and they diplex another AM onto that tower or those towers? Does that have to be notified and reapproved?
It does have to be notified. By the way, we read the rules. The good news is AMs usually don't cause a problem because there's very little stuff that the FAA cares about in that frequency band. The things that they were worried about were localizer or marker beacons and non-directional beacons, which were below the AM broadcast band back in ancient times. Now there are very few of them around. So I wouldn't worry about it from a frequency interference point of view with the FAA. I doubt you'd have a squawk. It's usually the FMs that where there's a little bit of trouble.
I understand, but it says if it involves adding or changing frequencies, and I have several sites where things have been, where, diplexes and triplexes have been built, and I'm not sure that the FAA was ever notified. And I'm wondering if I need to go and check all those sites to make sure that the frequencies of all of the operating AMs are actually a part of the FAA records.
Okay, that can be done on the FAA OE site, and you can see what was in the determinations. It's by the FAA guidance, you should notify them, but tread carefully and gently and see what's on the record and what needs to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Well, I know that the commission, generally speaking, if you're 100 feet off or 50 feet off or something like that, they will walk you through, for LPFMs especially, correcting these things. But you're saying that really, if they're off, they need to consider where, if they're over 200 feet, where the FAA would be.
Right, or if they're close enough to an airport structure where they have to be notified, even if they're less than 200 feet. And again, the reason the RF emissions, particularly the FMs, are of concern, I have this little handy slide showing you all the upper, on the right-hand side, the left image is of an ILS. It's the localizer that sits at the distant end of the runway to glide the aircraft to the runway. The image next to that is the glide slope, the up-down guidance, and you can see the placements there. And the instrument landing system has a left-right guidance, which goes from 108.1 to 111.95 megahertz. And that's where it gets into trouble with FMs being 108 to, 88 to 109.7. And the VOR stations they give you lateral guidance. They're the things that look like upside down ice cream cones. If you're driving around on some of this funny antenna structure out there, that gives you in-route guidance and supports non-precision approaches into airports. And they're also down there 108 to 117.95. So they're right next door to the FM band. So you can have an intermod hit, or if you have a lot of power at the upper end of the FM band, sometimes if you're located in the wrong spot, it can cause real problems. And I've been an instrument pilot, and some of you guys I know are as well, and it will cause interference to communications and to the ILS navigation system. It's a real thing. And sometimes it's a fault of the radio being junky, and sometimes it's just the unfavorable combination of you and one or two other broadcasters causes an issue. Some of the remedial actions are you change your frequency, you change your location, you change your power, you change your antenna. If you have lots of pocket change, you can sometimes ask the airport to change the frequency of the nav aid, and they can do that, but that takes a couple, 3 years to pull off, and it's lots of dollar bills, more than I have in my spare pocket. But so it can be dealt with. But again, the original system we're using to study these concerns is an older set of software built on older assumptions, and we're waiting for the FAA to one day get the funds and the permission to update it to more modern technology. But we're sort of stuck with what we have now. And speaking of this, if any of you have a recent determination or has it recent as in 1980s and newer, look somewhere in the middle of it, and I've yellow highlighted it here in this slide. It'll say any changes in coordinates, heights, frequencies, or the use of greater power, except those specified by the Colo void clause, and will void this determination. So if you're changing the frequency on a tower, or you're adding a frequency to a tower with an existing determination, a modern determination will have that clause in there, and you've just avoided Boson and Tower Company's determination of no hazard for the whole stinking structure. So take a look at your determination of no hazard. Say, in ancient times when the West was wild and things were young and free, we'd say, oh, let's go to an existing tower. We don't have to notify anybody. And that was true before 1980. And now, if you're moving to somebody's tower, you're adding your frequency to their tower. Technically, you got to let them know about it. Technically, you void the determination of no hazard if you go ahead and mount them and they haven't gotten them other MAI approval from the FAA.
There's another part of that too, isn't there, Gary? The fact that you put a new exciter in, and you need to do that. That's why you do the occupied bandwidth, because you could very easily get a spur generated, intermod spur between two exciters on the same site, landing right on top of ATC.
Right, and that's when you get the enforcement division involved, because if you're interfering with the frequency, they get really excited about that. So it's the FCC enforcement division will come out, and if you pick on a sensitive federal agency, they show up and they don't have any sense of humor at all. So that's this stuff is real, and some of it actually does cause problems. It's not just an annoyance. And if you're the one sitting in an airplane and you're trying to get home, you don't want to have interference screw you up. The other thing I'll just mention in passing, it's a subject for another discussion, is the proposal to increase the digital sidebands and FMs. And you might know that there's been a squawk raised by the FAA and others. And that's because this model was created on analog FM, and the FAA just found out that now we're talking about adding more energy in carriers. And they don't know if it's going to be a problem or not. So they said, whoa, wait a minute. We'd like to look at it. We'd like to study it. So that's where there's a pause in some of the adoption permissions at the FCC. And there's actually a coalition, 8 different people like Garmin and Boeing and Airline Pilots Association and all that are getting together, working with the FCC and Xperi and the NAB to look at, is this an issue or not? And what does that mean? So there's a pause in some parts of that. So just be aware of, if you're asking for increased power, asymmetrical power sidebands in the upper part of the FM band, you probably can only do it on an experimental authorization, but we can talk about that in a different session. Okay, James.
Gary, can I ask you a question on that prior slide?
Sure.
Where it says of emissions from this site must be in compliance with the parameters set by collaboration between the FAA and telecommunications company and reflected in the FAA 5G C-band compatibility evaluation process. What does that all mean?
Well, that's a good catch. That was back in early times of 5G being adopted. Some of those systems were thought to clobber radar altimeters that are used when you're getting in close to the airport, particularly for a limited visibility approach. If you've watched airliners, you might hear the call outs like 200, 500, 50, 40, 20. That's coming from an onboard radar altimeter. And some of those 5G frequencies in the wrong location can interfere with the working of the radar altimeter and return bad information or no information and make the aircraft have to do a go around and go, instead of Washington, D.C., go to Boston or Richmond or something else. So that's what that refers to, is the 5G cellular radio guys.
So that doesn't affect broadcasters?
No, sir, it does not.
Just wanted to make certain with memories, and I'm sure some of the other people have experienced the issues with seventh harmonics, et cetera, up in the band there and interfering with cellular. So I didn't know if that was anyhow related.
Yeah, it is related. It's the same people in the circus. It's just a different area of concern. We had another question pop up in the chat and I missed it. Barry, did you catch that?
Yeah, it says here from Kelly, does the notifications to the FAA on a leased multi-use tower apply to cell, PCS, two-way, and amateur radio users, or is it mainly multiple broadcasters on the tower?
Again, looking at the yellow section here, if you're not one of the colo void frequencies, then you need to notify, is the short answer. And ham radios might require notification, but usually you don't have any issue with ham radios. Ham radios I don't recall of any particular instances of a complaint. There might be out there, but repeaters, I think you're okay, but again, the rule says if you're not in the colo void set of frequencies, which I don't believe all the ham radios aren't included there, because we're talking about above the TV band, those frequencies would probably be okay, but below that, you probably want to be cautious.
Very good. Anyone have a question so far? You have 3 ways to go. You can do it in the chat, raise your hand at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or alternate A or alternate or your space bar and join in the discussion.
So now James is going to tell you the complicated stuff, like how the heck do you do this? What's involved?
So assuming your project has to be filed with the FAA, the project needs to be submitted to the FAA's Obstruction Evaluation Group, or OEG for short. And when you submit to them, it's very primitive information, as I would describe it, that is provided to the FAA, such as the project's latitude, longitude, side elevation, maximum structure height. And once that's submitted to the FAA, it's reviewed by this obstruction evaluation group, which is really kind of divided into 2 separate silos. The first silo, as we're showing, are the wind turbine side. Those are, of course, large-scale wind turbines, meteorological towers that support those projects. And then everything else that's essentially non-wind turbine is all in this second container: towers, buildings, stadiums, solar panels, transmission, comms towers, etc. And the obstruction evaluation group is really this, I would say, smaller group within the FAA that consists of both technicians and specialists that are reviewing the project, making sure that everything reviews and plots appropriately, and then, of course, is disseminating it out to be reviewed by all these various offices, which I'll describe here soon. The obstruction evaluation group is a smaller outfit within the FAA. It's probably an organization that has a better part of maybe only 20 to 30-ish people at best. But they review over 20,000 cases a year. I'm sorry, 200,000 cases a year. So they're pretty busy with their assessments, and they have a high volume that they have to push through on an annual basis. And so they typically, do the best that they can with the time that they have, and I would say overall are typically responsive and able to help us, of course. Nevertheless, what guides them through their process, like we talked about earlier, is the Title 14 CFR Part 77. And of course, when a project has to be submitted to the FAA, under its authority, is determining whether or not this proposed structure is a hazard to air navigation, or is just seen as an obstruction, which is okay, provided it receives marking and lighting recommendations and it has other requirements it adheres to. But it's important to note that the FAA is not a permitting agency. They do not issue permits. They issue what is called a determination of no hazard, or a determination of hazard. However, that is typically not legally binding, standing alone on its own. The only federal obligation you have is to submit your project to the FAA. Whether or not they come to a favorable conclusion depends on, of course, what concerns, if any, come about in the FAA process. And it's typically for other reasons like financing, insurance, or permitting that requires an actual FAA determination of no hazard, which in turn, of course, forces the developer to pursue or get that determination of no hazard in hand. Otherwise, if you were somebody who was technically independently funded, didn't have any permitting requirements or insurance requirements, yes, we would strongly recommend getting a determination to no hazard. And if you don't get one, then there's a level of liability. But technically, by the rule of law, you don't require one.
So that's the interesting distinction here is they can't tell you no. They just say it's a bad idea, but it's up to you to decide to adhere to the recommendation or not, and that's when the happens.
And so to jumpstart this aeronautical study process, a project needs to file the FAA Form 7460-1. This is the notice of construction or alteration to an existing structure and or proposal of a temporary structure like a crane. And once this information, the latitude, longitude, side elevation, max structure height, are provided to the FAA technician will review and validate that data, make sure that everything plots appropriately and that it doesn't necessarily plot in some adjoining city or some other state. There's an error in the data. And once the technician has been able to validate and corroborate the information, the cases then go into work in progress status, meaning that the official review has now begun and the cases transfer into the hands of the FAA specialist.
And you can track this stuff online, but you can monitor the status of your.
Correct. Yeah, you have the ability to monitor the status of your project with the FAA. We have a couple other backdoor options that aren't publicly available that we are able to leverage in order to track this the status as well. But ultimately, we can see if things are moving along appropriately and hitting the appropriate timeline milestones and all as well. So once your project's filed with the FAA and the specialist has received the cases, that really is the point at which the FAA starts their, quote, initial review of the project. And this is where they're peeling back all the layers of the onion of airspace to determine what concerns, if any, may come up as a part of the FAA's process. And so the specialist is disseminating this information out to offices within the FAA, but also offices external of the FAA. So externally, you may have groups like the Department of Defense or Department of Homeland Security who may review a project. And internally, you may have other offices like Office of Airports or Flight Standards or Technical Operations that looks at electromagnetic interference, or the Obstacle Impact Team that looks at physical airspace, approaches, departures, etc. Regardless, at the end of this review by all interested parties, if there are no concerns and there's no reason that the FAA can't issue a determination of no hazard immediately, then they can do just that. They can go ahead and issue that determination of no hazard for the project. However, in most instances, and if we're talking about structure, large tower structures here, the likelihood is less that they're going to be able to issue a determination of no hazard immediately. Rather, they're going to have to first issue a notice of preliminary findings. And a notice of preliminary findings is the FAA's way of saying, hey, we completed our initial review. Here's what we found. What do you want to do about it?
Don't ignore that notice. A lot of people ignore it, just assuming it's more paperwork. I'll put it on the back burner. If you don't tell them, yes, I want to go forward, the thing dies, right?
Yeah, so notices, you have a 60-day response window for notices of preliminary findings. And if you don't respond in that 60 days, and your cases are terminated and now you're forced to start from scratch. But if you respond to the notices and you tell the FAA that you would like to continue through their process, that's really what brings about the next step, which is further study and public comment. And public comment is a statutory 30 to 37-day period where, if it's relevant and if your structure is tall enough, it has to go out to interested aviation parties to solicit their feedback on your project. Essentially, as I describe it, it's the FAA's way of fact-checking themselves in their own review, making sure there's nothing they missed. And concurrent to public comment is also further study, where the FAA is internalizing what some of these concerns may be and determining if they can resolve those internal to the FAA.
But the public comment has to be aviation related, like from a pilot or an airport. It can't be, gee, I don't like this tower next to my house.
Yeah, it has to be based on sound aeronautical principles. So if somebody says, I don't like this tower, the FAA is not going to do anything with that. But if they say, hey, FAA, I think that this tower is approaching instrument approach procedure going into this airport. Have you looked at this? Well, the FAA either has already looked at it, in which case they can respond, or if they haven't or they missed it, they can go back and do so at that time. And the idea is at the end of further study and public comment, if there's no concerns and if the FAA is able to adjudicate any sort of concerns that may have been flagged, then FAA determinations of no hazard, or DNHs for short, are issued. And determinations are valid for 18 months from the date of issuance. If construction, defined as the pouring of foundation, takes place on or before that 18-month expiration date, there are supplemental notices that we can submit to the FAA to then lock in those determinations. However, if construction is not slated to start until after that 18 months, then there's always the possibility of being able to request a one-time 18-month extension of the FAA as well.
But that opens up Pandora's box potentially, yes?
It does. So when you request an extension, it's not administrative, it's not guaranteed. the FAA is going to go back and re-review portions of the project to see if there's any sort of airspace that may have changed since their first assessment 18 months prior. And determinations of no hazard are going to include other requirements such as marking and lighting, along with, of course, pre-construction notice requirements, meaning that if you're going to build a structure, they may say, we need you to alert us X amount of days prior to the start of construction so that we can modify the airspace in order to accommodate the project.
One other point is not just the tower you're building, but if you're going to use big cranes to construct your tower and they exceed the height that you asked for, that's a problem, is it not? And you have to let them know when your cranes are going up and
It is, yeah. So if you're approved for a tower up to, let's say, 500 feet, but you need a 700-foot tall crane to erect that tower, that crane must be submitted to the FAA for their review as well. And so there's always the possibility that your permanent structure gets approved, but sometimes temporary structures aren't necessarily always a slam dunk and could cause airspace concerns as well. And once determinations of no hazard are issued, there is in a lot of instances a petition period on the back end of determinations as well. This is somewhat similar to the public comment period. However, it's not proactively sent out to everybody. Rather, this is one that if somebody's close to the process, they would know when the appropriate time is to write into the FAA. But within the first 30 days after determinations are issued, somebody could technically petition that if they felt that the FAA may have missed something in their review, they could always write into the FAA.
But this has to be, again, for a legitimate airspace concern and not because Aunt Bessie doesn't like it.
Correct. And then finally, the last thing is, and I know I mentioned this a second ago, but there are requirements for pre and post construction notices for the project as well, meaning that there may be a requirement to let the FAA know 10, 30, 45, 60, or 90 days ahead of when construction is going to start, as a means for them to modify airspace that may have been impacted by the project, albeit it was approved, just that the FAA is going to have to change that airspace now to accommodate your building or your antenna. So,
and they also have to change notices on charts and those kinds of graphics that the pilots use.
And then this next set of slides, I won't go, or this next slide here, I won't go into great detail with, but the point or the takeaway from it is that all throughout the FAA's aeronautical study process, Capital Airspace Group has the ability to conduct various diligence analyses and or supporting analyses that may help a project get through the FAA's aeronautical study process. So there are certain early on initial risk assessments or diligence studies that we can do to include airspace analyses or microwave or communication studies or radar analyses. And on the back end, there's other types of studies that we might be able to do, such as traffic flow analyses that determines the significant volume of impact of certain airspace concerns and how we might be able to use that data to get the project across the finish line with the FAA.
So you as a non-aviation professional can file with the FAA and follow the process and do a good job. But if something gets itchy or you're just concerned about it, then you can hire a firm like this one. This is not meant to be a commercial, but just to clarify that we know, just like with the engineering side of the practice, we know who to talk to at the FCC and say, gee, is this going to smell too bad for you to grant? And what are the concerns and how can we help get this through? So there are always helpers out there in exchange for money, of course. But anyway, a lot of this can be done by yourselves, but if it gets sticky, for example, if the Department of Defense doesn't like what you're doing because you're intruding onto airspace that they set aside for training routes, and there is a ton, then we can help you in that process because there's only a certain way you can talk to the DoD without getting in trouble, I suppose. So we can help with that kind of sticky situations. Like when you need a lawyer, you call the lawyer. If you don't need them, don't call them.
Yeah, it's one of those, if you need us, you need us. If you don't, we'll tell you you don't. So
yeah.
These are just some quick reference guides here. Gary earlier talked about this page, oeaaa.faa.gov. And this essentially is the FAA's portal for all things filing. And so there's just a couple areas that we would direct you to for immediate points of interest. One is the search archives, that if you're trying to find an old aeronautical study number, you can do a circle search for cases. You can look and try to find that in their system. There's a whole frequently asked questions section there. And then at the bottom of the frequently asked questions options, there's also the FAA notice criteria tool that we talked about earlier, that if you punch in the coordinates, latitude, longitude, site elevation, etc. for your project, the output of that tool will tell you if you need to file yes or no. And then at the bottom of this page, there's also on and off airport contacts. So hypothetically, if you have a project or a question that you'd like to supply to the FAA, these are the appropriate contacts that you can float some of those questions by if you have any thoughts or concerns related to your project.
There's a lot of helpful people at the FAA. They really are interested in being helpful, and it's just, treat them kindly. So that it's good to, the other thing, James, just if you can touch briefly on, many states have the right to review what you're proposing, and they can get in the way of a project, even if the FAA says yes. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, correct. So, I mean, and not just even states, counties and local municipalities may have all their own zoning or height zoning requirements and all too. So even if you're in a position where the FAA has issued a determination of no hazard, there's always the potential that a state could try to gum up the works with your project as well. So it's really good to have, if you have a council as far as local zoning permitting is concerned, it's good to know and understand, are there any other obstacles from a height standpoint that could come up as a part of your development?
Like the such and such state Department of Aviation might want to review structures, and they do it routinely, and they can object. And local teeth in this case are sharper than federal teeth. So you got to pay attention. There's an infamous county board that shuts down projects all the time because they are really, really strict on what they want done. So pay attention to that. Know if there's something in your region that can affect that. Here's the advisory circular we're talking about. And if you can go on the FAA website, you can see the 7460-1M. That's the advisory circular. It has all the goodies in there, which is, gee, should it be marked and lit and how? The FCC Part 17 kind of refers to this, construction, marking, and lighting of antenna structures. 17.6 is who's responsible for painting and marking, and 17.23 points right back to the FAA. They do what they said. So they're shaking hands quite a bit here. James, you want to go to the next one? Here's some of the helpful stuff you see in the back of this 7461M. And by the way, these things get updated. The left-hand side is what the criteria are for different heights of towers and what kind of lights you should use and how many bands of what color that you can put on it. And the thing on the right is the legends of what all the little marks mean for red lighting and for painting. The next slide will tell us about white obstruction lighting. In many cases, if you use strobes or white obstruction lighting, you don't have to paint the tower. So that's a get out of jail for painting the tower thing if you use white lighting. You may run into trouble though with the FAA allow it because sometimes a pulsing white light can look like the end of a runway. So they're not going to let you use these everywhere. And also if you're near a residential area, they get kind of crabby about pulsing white lights, so that again, it's one of these things we have to look at the local environment and have the FAA say that, yes, you can. There's actually something permissive. It's like I can't think of the term, but you can ask them, gee, can you look at this just for fun? What is that called at the FAA?
Feasibility study.
A feasibility study. Carries no weight, but you say, gee, if I wanted to put strobes on my tower, would you be cool with it? And they'll look at it and tell you yes or no, and you know whether you want to proceed or not. But then you got to file again. The filing process and the granting process, we didn't cover that, but that can take, what, 18 months?
It depends. On the short end, a filing process can be as little as, just 1 to 3 months in a completely benign environment. But the taller your structure is, the longer that process could take. If you're somewhere in the realm of 500 feet, still benign, you're probably still looking at a 4 to 6 month process. And then if there's any reason for concern or discussion, mitigation, et cetera, now you're looking easily at a 9+ month long process for sure.
What about if you're just changing the lights? If you're going from incandescent to LED, is this going to require an FAA determination? And then secondly, what about IR? Do you have to put IR lights in?
Yeah, so if you're just going to the FAA for a marking and lighting request, that's probably something that's only going to take realistically somewhere in the realm of probably 2 to 8 weeks, just depending on FAA specialist workload. Typically with those, you get a pretty quick answer if you're just trying to mark or update some lighting for the structure. And then with respect to IR, the advisory circular really states in the requirements of any sort of lights at this point is that they must be night vision goggle compatible. So any supplier of FAA approved lighting, that should already be a feature that's a part of their product. So it's worth the ask and worth making sure, but everything should be night vision goggle compatible at this point moving forward.
And most of the lighting suppliers are reputable and can help you quite a bit. They're really
Yeah.
great. Somebody else had a question, Barry. Did you catch that?
Yes, Alan said he has had trouble trying to file a 7460-2 form to notify the FAA of dismantled towers that are more than about 40 years old. The online form chokes if you try to enter an aeronautical study that dates back to the 70s. FAA staff are not always able to deal with this issue.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, my first instinct would be to go to the specialist in that contacts page. And if those are the people you're working with or trying to work with and they're not helpful, I would say that's when you probably want to circle up with us, because there's managers and support folks from that side that we could possibly still leverage. But I would try that contacts section first, and if those are people you haven't interacted with, these are likely the right people to engage with. However, if those are the people who are not being helpful, then there's at least some supervisors and all we might still be able to go to. So
Yeah, these guys are swamped. They're busy, so they don't mean to be crabby. Well, some do maybe, but most of them want to be helpful. You can go to the next slide. This next slide just tells you, taller, thinner, blonder on the left, and the right-hand slide tells you about dual lighting possibility, like white lights in the day, red lights at night. No painting on the tower. That satisfies a lot of zoning boards. So you need FAA approval for that. But
I'd like to make a comment if I can here.
please.
I'm looking at your illustration of the tower on the right-hand side, the way it's guyed and so on, and that's exactly the way the KFI tower in Los Angeles used to be.
Yeah, this is right
And
off
it
the FAA form. FAA.
It had incandescent lighting, nighttime only.
Yep.
And I wanted to put daytime strobes on it and whatever the companion lighting was at nighttime. So we applied to the FAA, and I kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And 18 months later, they came through with the approval to do the project. Well, by that time, my capital expenditure money was gone, so I did not get to do the project. And I retired from KFI, and I think it was 2 years later that an airplane crashed into about the top 10 feet of that tower that's on your illustration there on the right. And that caused, well, first of all, the airplane then crashed down on the ground and 2 people in it were killed. And it also caused the tower to collapse and everything went down on the ground. And I still feel badly about that, because I think that if the FAA hadn't taken so long, I would have had daylight strobes on there and the airplane probably would have seen it.
Well, you can't own that. The pilot owns some responsibility, and there's a certain height above ground you're not supposed to fly. KFI, that's what part of is that Los Angeles, or I don't remember. What city is that in?
Well, the problem was the KFI tower was 750 feet tall.
Okay.
And the Fullerton Airport is not too far away. And I think this plane was coming in to land at Fullerton and was down a little too low and hit the top of the tower and caused it.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but you hate to say it, but I'm betting the lighting wouldn't have changed anything. But
I don't know, maybe in these modern times now, this was back in 2004, if I remember correctly. And maybe today the FAA is able to give those approvals in a more expeditious manner.
Oh, I don't know, James. Sometimes not.
Yeah, I mean, in most instances, they're pretty quick about turning them around. Like we talked about earlier, probably about 2 to 4, 2 to 6 or 8 weeks at most, typically. But I mean, there are one-off instances or special cases where they drag their feet because it's at the end of the day, it comes down to safety for them and what do they feel is safe or isn't safe. And occasionally, if it's something that's on the bubble, that takes longer sometimes. But
Yeah,
That's the reason for
KFI
delay.
must have fallen into that trap, and that's why it took them 18 months to do it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I do believe, though, that the new owner, the station was transferred to new owners a couple of years, no, about the time I retired in 2000. And the new owners, when they replaced the tower, I think, as I understand it, I haven't been down to see it in the daytime, but I think now they have daytime strobes on there, and it's an all modern lighting system, so things are better. And also the tower is not quite as tall. They put a top hat on it and shrunk it down to 680 feet.
Got it. Yeah. On that topic, again, say it loud and proud, you can't change anything in tower structure and lighting land and painting land without FAA approval, period. If you're changing something, then you have to let the FCC know about it through the ASR process. Again, older specifications are grandfathered and can be kept, but we just had an example there that maybe keeping the old specifications wasn't the best idea. If you have steady burning red marker lights, if you're of a certain height, you can have those changed because the FCC biologists and others are concerned about these being a hazard to birds. Apparently birds are dumb at night, and steady burning red lights attract them, and they thwack themselves in a tower and kill themselves. The FAA can entertain a change to get rid of the steady burning lights. Doesn't mean those lights go away. It means you now have to have lights that flash in synchrony with the top beacon. But again, it requires FAA approval. Next one. Interesting gotchas. Each new or altered structure has to comply with FAA painting and marking and lighting. The determination no hazard by the FAA is what rules this. All the marking and lighting will be on there. The FCC says the stuff in the FAA study is mandatory. So that's where you have the FCC has stronger handcuffs. The FAA has none. So if the FCC says you got to do what the FAA said in this instance, then you need to as an FCC licensee. So that's one of those things to keep in mind. When you have a structure above 200 feet, or you're near an airport, even a 20-foot structure can be a problem, you have to register it. So two methods, again, is, are you going to have to mark and light this tower? You have to register it. What do you do with it? The FCC says it's your responsibility to determine if you need to coordinate with the FAA. You got to decide what to do. If you coordinate with the FAA and the FAA gives you a determination of no hazard, then you have to do an antenna structure registration with the FCC. If the FAA, and this is from the FCC's guidance, if the FAA exempts you from notification, then it's exempt from the ASR requirements of the FCC. So that's kind of a good thing to know. Here's a famous TAL Air form. As we said, it's your first cut to determine at the FCC side, should you notify the FAA. It is not as rigorous as the FAA's examination, but if you fill out this form and it says no problem, then as far as the FCC licensing process is concerned, no problem, move on. Next one. We talked about the FAA notice criteria tool. It is more rigorous. It includes other things that the FCC tool does not. So that's, we've touched on that before, and I'm trying to cut it short here because we're getting close to the magic hour. When you want to file an antenna structure registration, you have to submit the determination no hazard from the FAA. If you do not receive determination of no hazard, the FCC will not give you an antenna structure registration. If you have something that needs to be registered and it doesn't have an FAA approval, you don't have an antenna structure registration on file, they will not process your application for anything. So that's the gotcha. And that's written in the FCC guidance. So that's the gotcha. You have to have an ASR if the FAA thinks you do. Any other questions, folks? Feel free, as a shooting gallery, come at us.
Kelly, threw a comment in that he hears some FAA staff have received the fork in the road emails. And if the staff take the buyout, he thinks everybody is going to be busier and more delays in the future.
We haven't heard any immediate feedback from anybody that we liaise with at the FAA about, there being any sort of exodus, mass exodus, et cetera, at least from the folks that we interact with. So we wouldn't immediately forecast that as being an immediate concern. However, it is something that we continue to pay attention to. Of course, things could change. But it doesn't seem like it's one that very many people have bid on at this point, at least with the areas and departments we work with.
Uh-oh, Ben wants to ask a question.
Excuse me, actually, I just have a comment. In situations where there are multiple towers very close together, it's not at all unusual for the FAA to allow some of them to not be lighted. And there are numerous examples of this in the multiple tower AM antenna situation, but even occasionally in other cases. So don't hesitate to ask when you're asking for your determination that some of the towers not be lighted. The FAA, in our experience, has been utterly unwilling to change the style or the geography of lighting on a tower, but they will, from time to time, give us permission to take the lights off a tower or to not light a tower to begin with. The tallest towers I've ever gotten permission to unlight were 700 feet. So, but they were right next to a 1,000-foot TV tower.
That falls under the marking of a group of obstructions, and that's in that 7461M. And I forgot what Ben, you might remember, or James, what's it within so many 100 feet of another lit structure? You don't have to light the companion structure. There's some kind of guidance on that.
Yeah, it depends. You have to be relatively close. We typically recommend looking at it on our side just to determine or go back and make sure. And if not, at the very least, somebody should be coordinating it with the FAA. Just because the FAA, even though it may be in the advisory circular, they may still make a judgment call on their side as well, to say that they are or are not going to require lighting. So it just depends and can certainly be a case-by-case basis, I would say.
I think it's
not quite so bad a situation as it used to be, because the modern LED type lights and strobe lights don't take as much energy, but we've had cases where we've had to double up the current transformers on towers in order to get all the doggone lights lit. So getting them off was a real benefit. The other thing I'd like to point out is that if you have an EMC complaint that's preventing registration of a structure with the FAA, and you look at their determination of what they think the physics are, if they're full of baloney, don't hesitate to get the material together and properly challenge them. We've even had FAA people who withheld information illegally about their facilities in the past. So, find an expert if you think you're being sandbagged on an EMC situation.
That's correct. There are ways to address a concern with tower height and with electromagnetic compatibility. And sometimes it's either a misunderstanding, sometimes the data is wrong, sometimes you just have an overworked technician. And if you really want to fight, you can often have success. And as I said before, there's other options, such as you change a frequency, they change a frequency, antennas are changed. There are predictive things you can do, but yeah, it's worth not giving up. It's worth having further discussions to see if you can't advance.
We haven't had it happen recently, but we've even had FAA communications personnel just plain lie to us about some of their facilities. And of course, because they're all restricted access, it's a little difficult to challenge that, but we've been able to do it at least once or twice in the past.
Yeah, I think you can get a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, and there's other mechanisms to get data. So
part of it also is the age of the site and, again, workload. I remember that one time some years ago, we got a call from the local ATC demanding that we turn the transmitter off because we were interfering with them. And I said, no, I don't think we are. And they said, "Oh yeah, we hear your music. We hear it right now." And I said, "Okay, well, put the spare exciter on. No difference." Looked a little further. The Intermod product wasn't coming from us at all. It was coming from a different station. And to make the long story short, even though it wasn't us, we actually went out and bought a filter for their radio, but the FAA won't install a filter that they didn't buy.
Harry, I had something similar. I got called to solve a problem in Pasadena area. Well, it was affecting the Los Angeles area on some FAA frequency where they blamed the radio station for it, an FM broadcaster whose call letters I can't remember at the moment. But anyway, I found a second harmonic where it made the modulation double. And I thought, this is really strange. Where is this coming from? And I didn't quite get it traced. Well, I did get it traced down to not being the radio station they were accusing of it. And the FAA technician finally came out and he found it was coming from a transmitter that had been used in the Rose Parade that they'd left on. And that was causing the problem. Then I had another one where I got a call from the FAA, just like you did. And they accused us, KACE FM, of their music showing up in one of their receivers. So we kind of checked and we didn't hear anything on the frequency they said it was on, but then went down to their facility, which was in the Baldwin Hills, not far from this transmitter, and found that they had an antenna that had corroded, and that's where the problem was. And luckily they had a spare antenna that they were able to switch to, and the problem was solved there, right there in the FAA building.
Any EMC complaints, if people can keep calm and ungrouchy with each other, that goes a longer way, particularly if you say, "Hey, I want to help you, but I'm certain it's not us, but we're going to work with you." That'll go a long way. Where things get sticky, in my experience, is if the problem is to the airborne receivers, because you can't put a receiver in a filter in each and every one that goes overhead. That it gets more difficult. Those instances are rarer these days than they were 30, 40 years ago, because the radios have changed, installations have changed and been upgraded. But it requires people use diplomacy even when you're cranky about it. You gotta work with
Yeah,
it.
we were as pleasant as we could be, and the guy in the tower was reasonably pleasant. Finally, he called and they sent in a crew from LA with a directional finding, and they discovered that the problem was a corroded fence about 10 miles west of town that was collecting a different radio station and popping it on their ATC channel. So the guy was very apologetic to us, but again, policy said that they couldn't accept the filter that we offered them.
Right. Well, there's a liability train on that, and it all boils down to responsibility for problems, liability. Anything else, guys and gals? Hey, we're for free. Ask us questions, you know.
Well, I
Again,
think
any changes you make on the towers, on your towers, or any, take a look at all the underlying regulations, just not FCC, but FAA and local zoning. And there's a lot of layers to the onion to look at. And temper management's enthusiasm with it's a process, it's a regulatory process. It can take time.
yeah.
It may not be desirable, but no government agency is going to move as quickly as you wish.
Well, again, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to be with us. And between the Zoom and the YouTube, we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 55, 60 folks and you explained everything. That's why there probably weren't more questions. And I'll just mention again that fccinfo.com is the site that the company puts up with every bit of information you would like to know about the licenses and sites. Easier to deal with an LMS. And these guys, as you can tell, are quite willing to come and receive your questions. And maybe if you need some big help, give them a call for that too.
The meter doesn't always run when you ring the phone, and we're glad to try to help you out. So, feel free to call James for FAA issues and me for other kind of issues. And there's a lot of other helpers out there that are skilled in these areas. Just go to the folks that have had the experience, and most of us like to share. So call anytime.
Well, again, we want to thank you very much, and hope you come back for another discussion one of these days. There's so many topics dealing with RF that not even with the FAA, but just standard RF. I'd love to pick your brains someday.
Our pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you all. Nice meeting you.